Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Living Ancestor podcast. This is your host, Ramon Castellanos from Eating Ancient Virtue. And in today's podcast, I wanted to discuss with you a vitally important aspect of ancestor work that is often either ignored or not spoken about as often as it ought to be, which is blessing retrieval. Now, what is blessing retrieval? Well, fundamentally, in some ways, it's as simple as it sounds, yeah? Which is to retrieve blessings from the ancestral. But in another way, it represents a kind of cosmology, which is that the ancestral has blessings for us, and that for whatever reason, they have not been able to flow into our lived experience. It's almost like a backlog of blessing or a blockage of the flow of blessing into our lives. Now, there's several reasons for this, and we're going to talk about each of them as far as I understand them today. And of course, possibly someone could say that there are more, but I'm going to give you the big ones to focus on today, and then I'm going to discuss with you how to actually, in a very simple way, start to call forth blessings from the ancestral. Now, one of the things to keep in mind is from the get-go, Western culture, modern people, and what we could say modern Western culture, which is the intersection between those two currents, is fundamentally disconnected from ancestral currents. And there is a resurgence, and of course, if you're listening to this podcast, you are a part of this resurgence, to reconnect to ancestral lifeways and to ancestral veneration. And with that comes an increased amount of relation to the ancestors in a way that's conscious. Because fundamentally, human beings are in relationship to the ancestral already. There's no getting away from that. More so, what's occurring in modern Western culture is that the ancestral is not being related to on a conscious basis, and that because of that, the current of the ancestral, this ongoing momentum of the patterns that the living actually inject into day-to-day life. One of the quotes that covers that really well comes from Daniel 4, which is that the ghosts are baked into the system. So there's that aspect. But then there's also the dead and the state of the dead that starts to accumulate, and it has in modern Western culture been accumulating for the last few thousand years with less and less and less conscious engagement with that current. So basically, what we have is an ancestral current that is mostly in the backdrop of our consciousness, that the flow between the ancestral and the lived experience is full of static, basically, that there's blockages inside of it, and that the state of the ancestral is not in the level of health that it could be. If we were thinking about the ancestral kind of like a garden, at this point the garden has been overrun by weeds and voracious insects that are trying to destroy the fruits that it could bear, so to speak. The fruits in some ways could be thought of as the blessings. But with that, there comes this understanding that when we begin to engage with the ancestral, a big part of what people immediately notice and focus on is the damage. It's the things that we don't actually want in our lives or want in our experience. One of the terms is ancestral karma, in a sense, and in this way we could just say that karma is a pattern that has some kind of cause and effect, so to speak, in our experience. But there's all of this ancestral karma that are debts, so to speak, that have been created in the past that have not been paid. There's all these polarizations inside the ancestral. There are layers and layers and layers of suffering that have occurred over the last few thousand years. There are diasporas. There are people who have died. There have been broken family systems that do not have the healthy family dynamics of tribal and tribal lifeways that our ancestors used to have. There is the loss of cultures. There's a lot in the ancestral that is fundamentally difficult to deal with. And when we begin working with the ancestral, that is often what immediately comes to the surface. Not always right away, but let's put it this way. There are stages. Let's start a basic ancestral veneration practice, which is maybe set up a shrine, maybe start to give offerings, and there's a level there of I'm just stepping at the doorway of the ancestral house, saying hello, knocking on the door, right? And everything can be kind of superficial but also pleasant, yeah? And immediately things can start to shift. It's kind of like engaging a long lost family member and saying, "Hey, how are you doing? It's great to see you. It's so nice to be in your presence. Let's sit and have a cup of tea," right? But what ends up happening then is that you come into the house and you sit down. And if you really want to get into deeper relationship, you start to talk about what has happened to the lives of the two people in the room over the last, couple of decades of not having been with these families. And in this case, we're talking about a couple thousand years. And so then the hardships start to come up, the challenges, the hopes and the wishes, the dreams lived and not lived, the things that are settled and unsettled in the person. And this then brings us to the next phase of ancestor work, which is when we start to engage more deeply with the ancestors. A big part of what ends up happening is that you as an individual person become a node for the healing and the release of backed up ancestral content, so to speak. And that's often the more difficult ancestor work. This is where we end up getting into like ancestral healing, or we have to do ancestral clearing work or something like that. Side note, ancestral clearing is something that can be a little bit misunderstood because the ancestral is a living field of relationality that we are in contact with. So when we're clearing, we're not really clearing the ancestors most of the time as beings. More so, we are often changing the relational dynamic that we have to particular aspects of ancestors, or our life, as I said, is a node inside of a network that allows for the reconciliation of certain patterns, or that we have to literally talk to ancestors and ask them to shift their perspective, at least when it comes to us. So I want to just place that in the right context. But setting that aside for the moment, what we're talking about here is that when we begin engaging ancestor work, there's these different phases, and often there's this big phase of having to deal with the difficult stuff. But not only that, humans are fundamentally, in a lot of ways, most of us anyhow, biased towards the negative. So we tend to focus on the things that we don't want in our lives as opposed to the things that do. I think they've done research on this, and don't quote me on the exact numbers, but the amount of real estate that a negative event takes up in your psyche is something like 10 times bigger, or something like that, again, don't quote me on the exact number, than the amount that positive things take into our psyche. So we're paying attention a lot more to what we don't like versus what we do. Now, on top of that, modern culture places a really big emphasis on taking on hardship and difficulty, as opposed to the joyful and pleasant experiences of life, the things that we want in life. You can find a lot more bravado and ownership and pride in working really hard and hustling and grinding and doing all the really difficult things, instead of I took a leisurely day, or I had a pleasant afternoon, or I sat and had a great cup of kombucha or whatever the case may be. But a lot of times, focusing on and calling in and receiving the juicy, wonderful, joyful experiences and outcomes that we would love take a back seat. So because of that, our consciousness is already orientated towards the things we don't want. So when you combine the state of the ancestral, as it is now in our relationship to it, along with this negativity bias, what you have is a field of ancestor work that is fundamentally lopsided, that doesn't have this bigger emphasis on getting the blessing side of the ancestor. Now, this is not necessarily the case in indigenous and traditional cultures where they did recognize that the ancestors could be problematic, and because of that, they had deep and intense protocols for working with the dead to make sure that the dead themselves became healthy, vibrant, loving, virtuous ancestors from which blessings could flow. So they understood that aspect of the garden being potentially overrun by voracious insects and weeds and stuff like that. But they also knew that if you took care of the ancestral garden, that it would bear fruit. So in our world today, we are in a place where not only are we trying to rebuild ancestral veneration practices, but Western culture does not have an indigenous ancestral veneration practice. We're rebuilding it from what indigenous cultures from other parts of the world have taught us in surviving traditions. And then some of us are also working directly with the ancestors, doing the first few phases of the work, which can be really difficult, in order to then bring forth new ways of working with the ancestral that are coherent and helpful, which is where I find my life, honestly. So with that said, working with the ancestors to retrieve blessing is something that for many people often takes, as I said, a back seat, but it doesn't have to. And it doesn't have to wait until you have done all these other layers of work to begin calling in the blessing side of things. Yes, having some kind of basic ancestral veneration practice is super helpful. Yes, also some kind of lineage repair process of some form is also very helpful. But as we begin to get into relationship with the ancestral, as we begin to give offerings, which energize fundamentally, offerings energize the ancestral currents, that tends to amplify their impact in our lives, but also offerings, they change the frequency of the ancestral as well, which is why it's understood in indigenous and traditional cultures that different offerings have a different influence on the relationship. Giving things like flowers and honey and sweets has a different impact than giving blood, for example, or red hot chili peppers, or whatever the case may be, right? So giving offerings in this way begins to affect the ancestral and begins to amplify the ancestral currents. As I said, the whole offering as medicine thing is a talk for another day. But what we can start to do, and this is a really simple thing, is to begin praying and asking the ancestors for the blessings that are for you to reach you. It's actually really simple. In the process of engaging with the ancestors in whatever way you do that, ask for the blessings that are for you to reach you. And for them to anchor into your lives, for them to grow, for them to flourish within your existence. Now, here is the thing, is that a lot of people, when they're working with the ancestral and they recognize that, hey, my ancestors can help me, they start to ask for specific things, specific outcomes. I want a new job. I want a red Corvette, whatever. Not that I want a red Corvette, because I generally don't like Corvettes, but that's beside the point. The real point is that instead of asking for a specific thing that we want, I want to invite you to leave it more open-ended and let the ancestral surprise you, because this is a big part of how this works, is that the blessing can actually come to you in a way that you are totally not expecting and may not even be where you're focused on currently in your life. You may be really focused on a business or trying to find a partner or trying to grow a brand or whatever the case may be, move to Nicaragua and do whatever you want to do. I don't know. So that is cool and fine to ask for, but not exactly what I'm talking about. More so the blessing layer in a way that's open-ended. Let whatever is already there for you come into your world. Now, here is the thing that might be a little bit uncomfortable. There are times in life where certain aspects of what we want are not ripe yet, right? So maybe the person that is for you is not one that you can meet at this point because of certain circumstances. Maybe going to Nicaragua is not going to be great for you in the long run. Maybe building this brand is a stupid thing to do. I don't know. Maybe it's not, but that's kind of the point, right? Is that you just don't know. So if you are going after something specific, that's cool. But it may not be the blessing that is there for you. Let the ancestral, with its larger vantage point that wants you to thrive. The ancestral fundamentally, when it's healthy, key point, wants you to thrive because you are the tip of the spear of the ancestral. You are the link in the chain that allows for thriving to occur, that allows for ancestral lives to move forward. And all of life, as far as we can tell on planet Earth anyways, has a thriving impulse. It's a part of us that if we're given the space and the resources, we will grow to whatever capacity we have to grow. We will reach our potential. This is seen in many different lives. This is why animals, for example, that could put into a territory that doesn't have a predator for them specifically can demolish a territory because they're not saying, oh, we should be more conscious of, not proliferating as much as possible. Like I live in Hawaii, and you often find lots and lots and lots of goats, wild goats out here that are not native to this place. And they are thriving. They're doing really well because they have a bunch of vegetation to eat, but they don't have any predators here. So they kind of just do what they want to do. The only people who kill them are humans, and they have to typically get licenses for that. And anyway, goats can demolish parts of the landscape. There are actually plants or trees that were native here, either trees or plants. I don't remember exactly what I was hearing about from a tour guide once that was telling me that entire species of plants have practically been completely demolished because the goats just ate. So basically the goat was saying, hey, there's no predators, there's food everywhere, and there are viable partners that want to have goat babies, so we're going to do that as much as we can. Right? That's an innate aspect of life. And thus, that's inside of you too. And the ancestral wants to support that when it's healthy. But there is this aspect of conscious active participation. We have to get into conscious relationship with the ancestral. We have to open ourselves, even if just verbally, vocally, to say yes, I want these blessings in my life. I want this to come into my experience. And then to ask for it in a conscious way, and then to let it surprise you, let it come in. And when I have done this, I have noticed that things that perhaps I was stuck with shifted in ways that were surprising. And the blessing moved in a way that I wasn't expecting. But that's the point, right? With that, what I would do is, if you start to do that on a conscious, continuous basis, is to stay open to the flow of omens, to the flow of synchronicity, or what we might call signs. Start to look for things that start to repeat themselves over and over and over again, and or that show up in dreams, or that you start to get a strong impulse that you haven't had to start doing something that maybe you haven't done or you've been planning to do, or that has been in the periphery, or maybe even something completely and utterly new. And start to see how things start to shift for you potentially. So, That's what I wanted to leave you with today, is that blessing retrieval is a really valuable part of ancestor work. And that older cultures knew that that was a big part of the reason to engage with the ancestral, was so that there was a flow of blessings coming into the world of the living. Okay, my friends, I hope this helps, and be well.